I'm Naomi, 32 female. I'm an architect, which is a polite way of saying I'm obsessed with structure, order, and things fitting together exactly as they should. My life is a series of blueprints, from the buildings I design to the way I organize my spice rack. I live with my fiancé, Ethan, a paramedic whose life is a landscape of controlled chaos, but even he appreciates the peace and order of the home we've built together. Our worlds are different. Mine is about preventing collapse, his is about managing it, but they complement each other perfectly. For the past year, I had poured all my professional skills and personal passion into the biggest project of my life, my wedding. It was going to be a masterpiece of planning and a true reflection of Ethan and me. But as you're about to hear, the people I thought were my foundational support system took a wrecking ball to my plans, hijacking every last detail for my sister's seemingly more important celebration. They thought their audacity would leave me in the rubble, but they forgot one thing about architects. We know how to read the fine print. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Our story began, as most do, with a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Ethan proposed on the anniversary of our first date on a windswept bluff overlooking the ocean. It wasn't a grand, public spectacle. It was just us, the sound of the waves, and a simple, perfect ring he designed himself. He knew me. He knew that the substance of a thing mattered more to me than the show. That quiet, profound moment was the cornerstone of everything we were about to build. We spent the next 2 weeks in a blissful bubble, just enjoying the feeling of being engaged before we even told our families. We wanted the foundation to be ours and ours alone. When we finally announced it, my family's reaction was predictably them. My mother, Eleanor, a former interior designer with an opinion on everything from fabric swatches to geopolitical conflicts, immediately started talking about color palettes. My father, Richard, a financial advisor, asked to see a preliminary budget before he'd even finished his congratulatory hug. And my younger sister, Isabel, who owned a chic little boutique bankrolled by my parents, held my hand to admire the ring and said, "Oh, it's so classic." In my family's language, classic was a synonym for safe or boring. Still, I chose to interpret their responses as their own quirky expressions of love and excitement. I was determined not to let their unique brand of commentary tarnish my happiness. This was my project, and I would manage it. As an architect, planning is my love language. The idea of orchestrating a wedding from the ground up was exhilarating. I bought a thick, leather-bound planner and created a master spreadsheet with more tabs than a federal budget. Timelines, vendor contact sheets, payment schedules, guest list logistics. It was all there, color-coded and cross-referenced. Ethan would watch me, amused, as I spent evenings drafting seating charts as if they were structural support diagrams. "Are you building a wedding or a skyscraper?" he'd ask, kissing the top of my head. "What's the difference?" I'd reply. Both required a solid foundation, meticulous attention to detail, and a clear vision. Our vision was clear, timeless elegance with a modern touch. We wanted a day that felt warm, personal, and full of love, not just a stuffy, formal affair. The first and most important piece was the venue. After months of searching, we found it, the Willow Creek Estate. It was a breathtaking historical property an hour outside the city, with sprawling gardens, a beautifully restored century-old manor, and a majestic willow tree that was rumored to be as old as the estate itself. It was perfect. It was also wildly popular, with a 2-year waiting list. By some miracle, a prime Saturday in September had opened up 18 months from then. We snatched it immediately, paying the hefty 50% deposit from our own savings without a second thought. This was our investment in our day. With the venue secured, the other pieces began to fall into place. We hired Julian, a wedding planner whose portfolio was a testament to his impeccable taste and flawless execution. He understood my vision instantly, appreciating my detailed spreadsheets rather than being intimidated by them. "Finally, a bride with a blueprint," he'd said during our first meeting, and I knew we'd work well together. Together, we secured the best of the best. We booked Sage and Time, a caterer renowned for their inventive, farm-to-table cuisine, whose tasting menu was a work of art. We found a photographer whose candid, light-filled shots captured emotion, not just poses. We hired a jazz ensemble that would create the perfect sophisticated ambience. Each decision was a collaboration between me and Ethan. Each deposit paid was a milestone, a tangible piece of the future we were building. We were a team, and it felt incredible. We had poured tens of thousands of dollars of our own hard-earned money into these non-refundable deposits, cementing our commitment not just to each other, but to the day we had envisioned. My parents had offered to contribute, but their offers always came with strings. Richard wanted veto power over any expenditure he deemed frivolous, and Alina wanted final say on all aesthetic choices. We politely declined, stating that we wanted to do this ourselves. This was our project, our responsibility. I think, on some level, they were offended, as if our independence was a rejection of them. Throughout the year, my family's involvement was minimal but persistent. Alina would email me unsolicited links to poofy dresses that were the exact opposite of my style. Richard would casually mention high-yield savings accounts where our wedding fund could have been working for us. Isabel would show me pictures of extravagant celebrity weddings on her phone and sigh, "Can you imagine?" Each interaction was a subtle reminder of their worldview, that everything was a performance, a competition. But I stayed focused, compartmentalizing their noise like I would a difficult client request. The plan was solid. The vendors were booked. The vision was becoming a reality. As we crossed the one-year mark and headed into the final 6 months, every detail was locked in. The invitations were designed, the menu was finalized, and my custom-made, elegantly simple dress was in its final stages of fitting. Everything was on schedule, on budget, and on vision. It was, on paper, the perfect day. The final countdown to the wedding had begun. With just 3 months to go, we were in the home stretch, a period I'd labeled final implementation phase on my spreadsheet. This was the time for minor tweaks and confirmations, finalizing the song list with the band, confirming guest numbers with the caterer, and agonizing over the perfect shade of ivory for the table linens. A pleasant, low-grade hum of excitement and nervous energy filled our apartment. Ethan and I had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, spending our evenings assembling wedding favors and practicing our first dance in the living room, laughing as we stumbled over each other's feet. Everything felt right, solid, and secure. The blueprints had been flawlessly executed, and now we were just watching the structure rise. My family, however, seemed to be on a different wavelength entirely. Whenever I tried to bring up a small wedding detail, my mother would change the subject. My father would look vaguely uncomfortable, and Isabel would be glued to her phone, a strange, secretive smile on her face. I chalked it up to them being tired of hearing about the wedding after a year of planning. I figured I'd just give them a break from the topic. But there was a strange tension in the air, a feeling of something brewing just beneath the surface that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The storm broke on a Sunday evening. My parents had invited Ethan and me over for dinner, a weekly ritual that had become increasingly strained. The moment we walked in, the atmosphere felt different, not just tense, but performatively cheerful. Alina was fluttering around the kitchen, wearing an apron over a silk blouse, a combination she never wore. Richard was opening a bottle of champagne that I knew was reserved for major announcements. Isabel was practically vibrating with nervous energy, her boyfriend, Marcus, sitting beside her looking like a deer in headlights. Marcus was a nice enough guy, a personal trainer she'd been dating for all of 6 months. He was handsome, agreeable, and seemed to worship the ground Isabel walked on. We sat down to dinner, and the small talk felt like wading through molasses. I tried to talk about a new building project I was leading at work, but my mother cut me off to ask Marcus about his gym's expansion plans for the 3rd time. Finally, after clearing the dessert plates, Richard stood up, champagne bottle in hand. "Well," he said, beaming in a way that set my teeth on edge, "we have some wonderful news to share." He popped the cork, and the sound echoed the sudden pounding in my chest. Eleanor clasped her hands together, looking at Isabel with tears in her eyes. Isabel, dear, why don't you tell them? Isabel took a deep, theatrical breath and held up her left hand. On her finger was a diamond so large it looked like a geological sample. Marcus and I are engaged, she announced. A wave of forced, boisterous celebration filled the room. My parents hugged her, crying tears of joy. Ethan and I, caught off guard, offered our congratulations. Of course, we were happy for them, but the timing and the sheer scale of the production felt off. Isabel had never once mentioned wanting to get married. In fact, she'd always been critical of what she called the archaic institution of marriage. The real bombshell came next. And we don't want a long engagement, Eleanor declared, topping up everyone's champagne. 6 months of dating is more than enough when you just know. We're thinking a big engagement party soon, something to really celebrate this wonderful commitment. She looked directly at me, her eyes gleaming. And since Isabel is just starting out and this is all so sudden, she'll need some help. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew where this was going. Naomi, you've done such a marvelous job planning your wedding, my mother cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Everything is so organized. I was thinking, maybe you could let Isabel have a little chat with your planner, Julian? Just for some advice, some pointers on where to start. It would be such a huge favor. The request was framed as something small and innocent, a simple act of sisterly kindness. But the way my whole family was looking at me, with expectant, unwavering stares, made it feel like a demand. They weren't asking, they were telling. Ethan, bless him, could read the room perfectly. He put a hand on my knee under the table, a small, grounding gesture. That's a nice idea, he said smoothly, his paramedic-calm voice cutting through the tension. But Julian is probably pretty focused on our wedding right now, with it being just a few months away. Maybe we could buy Isabel a few hours with a different planner as an engagement gift. My parents' smiles tightened. Oh, don't be silly, Ethan, Richard said with a dismissive wave of his hand. This is a family matter. Naomi wouldn't mind helping her sister, would you, honey? The pressure was immense. Saying no would make me the villain, the selfish older sister who couldn't even share a phone number. Saying yes felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I could close. I tried to find a middle ground. Of course I'll help her, I said, forcing a smile. She can have all my spreadsheets and checklists, and I suppose she can call Julian for a quick consultation, but we have to be clear that his priority is our wedding. His contract is with us. My mother's smile widened. Wonderful, that's all we're asking. Later that night, as we drove home, Ethan was quiet for a long time. I don't like this, Naomi, he said finally. The way they looked at you, it wasn't a request, it was an ambush. It's just my family being my family, I sighed, though I felt the same unease. They're dramatic. Isabel gets what Isabel wants. They'll get some ideas from Julian, realize how expensive and difficult it is to plan a party in a few weeks and then scale back. It'll be fine. But as I said the words, they tasted like a lie. I had a sinking feeling that this was not the end of it. This was the beginning. I had agreed to a favor, but I was about to find out they were planning a hostile takeover. The 2 weeks following Isabel's engagement announcement were strangely quiet. My family, usually so prone to constant communication, went silent. There were no follow-up calls about wedding planners, no frantic texts from Isabel asking for vendor recommendations. I told myself it was a good sign. As I'd predicted to Ethan, they had probably looked into the reality of planning a last-minute gala and decided to do something more reasonable. The knot in my stomach began to loosen. I refocused on my own rapidly approaching wedding, diving back into the final, pleasant details. I spent an entire afternoon happily debating the merits of calligraphy versus modern sans serif fonts for the place cards. It felt good to be back in control, back in my world of structured, predictable beauty. The first crack in my carefully constructed piece appeared as a hairline fracture. I called Julian, my planner, to ask his opinion on the font dilemma. I was expecting to chat with him directly, as we always did. Instead, I was put through to his assistant, a young woman who sounded flustered and apologetic. Julian's in back-to-back meetings all week, I'm afraid, she said, her voice a little too high. He's been absolutely swamped with a new high-priority event that came up. A new event. Julian had explicitly told us he never took on new clients in the 3 months leading up to a wedding to ensure his existing clients had his undivided attention. It was one of the reasons we hired him. "Oh," I said, a little confused. "That's surprising. Well, could you just ask him to give me a call when he has a moment?" The assistant promised he would, but the call never came. A few days later, the hairline crack fractured into a gaping chasm. I was clearing out my email inbox, deleting junk mail and flagging vendor confirmations, when an email from Sage and Time, our caterer, caught my eye. The subject line read, "Invoice 743B Isabel's Event Willow CR. Eek Estate." My blood ran cold. Isabel's event, it had to be a mistake. Maybe they were catering her smaller party at a different location and just got the venue name wrong. My name was nowhere in the email. It was addressed directly to my mother, Eleanor. My cursor hovered over the message, my hand trembling slightly. I clicked it open. It wasn't a mistake. It was a nightmare in PDF format. The invoice was for a 5-course tasting menu for 200 guests. The menu selections were eerily familiar. The pan-seared scallops with saffron risotto, the wild mushroom tartlets, the lemon lavender wedding cake. They were my choices, the exact menu Ethan and I had spent an entire afternoon perfecting with the head chef. And then I saw the date of the event listed at the top of the page. It was our date. My wedding date. At my wedding venue. For a terrifying moment, the room tilted. I couldn't breathe. This had to be a clerical error, a bizarre, universe-breaking coincidence. There was no other rational explanation. My mind refused to process the alternative, that my family, my own mother and sister, would be capable of something so monstrous. My first instinct was to call my mother and demand an explanation, but I knew she would just spin a web of excuses and half-truths. I needed concrete facts. I needed to go to the source. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Willow Creek estate. I prayed that the event's coordinator, a warm woman named Martha, would pick up and laugh, telling me their system had a glitch. Instead, a young receptionist answered. "Willow Creek Estate, how can I help you?" she chirped. I took a deep breath. "Hello, my name is Naomi. I'm calling to confirm a few details for my wedding on September 21st. The receptionist paused. I could hear the clacking of a keyboard. "September 21st, okay, I see the booking here. The primary contact for that date is Eleanor." She sounded confused. "We have notes here that the booking was transferred. You're listed as the original client, but all correspondence is now being handled by Eleanor and Isabel for their engagement party." The words hit me like a physical blow. Booking was transferred. Engagement party. It was real. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated act of betrayal. "Transferred?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "On whose authority?" The receptionist sounded uncomfortable now. "The notes just say your mother called last week to update the file. She said you and your fiancé had decided to postpone indefinitely, and that, to avoid the estate losing the booking, the family was stepping in to take over the date for your sister. Is that not correct?" I hung up the phone without answering. I felt numb, detached, as if I were floating above my own body, watching a stranger's life fall apart. They had used a lie, a story about me being in crisis, to systematically dismantle my wedding. They had painted themselves as saviors, rescuing the venue from a cancellation while simultaneously helping out their distraught daughter. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost impressive. Slowly, almost mechanically, I opened my laptop and navigated to the shared family calendar, a digital space I rarely visited because it was usually just a chaotic mess of Isabel's social engagements. I scrolled forward to September, and there it was. Blocked out in a bold, garish pink that was Isabel's signature color, spanning the entire day of September 21st, were the words, "Isabel's Engagement Gala." Below it, in the notes section, was a guest list that was nearly identical to mine. They had even invited my friends. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just a hijacked venue. This was a complete identity theft of the most important day of my life. And it had been orchestrated by my own family, smiling to my face while they drove a knife into my back. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the pink block on the calendar. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a cold, quiet rage that felt dense and heavy in my chest. It was the kind of anger that didn't scream, but calculated. My architect's mind, the part of me that craves order and logic, took over. My emotions were a tangled mess, but the facts were a blueprint waiting to be read. I wasn't going to cry, not yet. I was going to collect evidence. I was going to understand the full scope of the demolition before I even thought about what to do next. I called Ethan. I told him everything in a flat, emotionless voice: the email, the call to the venue, the calendar entry. I expected him to be as angry as I was, to start shouting about how we were going to confront them. Instead, he was silent for a moment, and then he said the three words I needed to hear most: "I'm coming home." When he walked through the door 20 minutes later, he didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around me and held me. It was Anil. Why then, cocooned in the safety of his embrace, that the tears finally came. They weren't loud, hysterical sobs, but silent, hot tears of betrayal. He let me cry it out, and when I was done, he looked me in the eyes. "Okay," he said, his voice firm. "They started this. We're going to finish it. What's the plan?" "The plan," I said, wiping my eyes, "is to understand the full extent of the damage." I explained my need to know exactly what they had done, what they had told people, and how they had managed to pull it off. He nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "You make a list of who to call. I'll make coffee. We do this together." For the next 4 hours, our living room became a war room. With a legal pad and a pen, I started making calls, putting my phone on speaker so Ethan could listen and take notes. I was calm, methodical, and polite on every call, playing the part of a confused client trying to clear up a misunderstanding. First on the list was Julian, the planner. This time, I didn't go through his assistant. I called his personal cell number, the one he had given us for emergencies. He answered on the second ring, sounding flustered. "Naomi, I was just about to call you." I knew it was a lie, but I played along. I calmly explained that I'd been in touch with the venue and that there seemed to be some confusion about my wedding date. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, he sighed, a sound heavy with guilt. "Look, Naomi, I am so sorry. Your mother and father came to my office last week." He recounted the story, and it was even worse than I'd imagined. They hadn't just said I was postponing. They had crafted a deeply manipulative narrative. They told Julian that I was going through a severe personal crisis, that my relationship with Ethan was on rocky ground, and that I was too embarrassed and distraught to call him myself. They presented themselves as concerned parents trying to manage a delicate situation. They told him I was taking a step back from life for a while. Then they made their move. They said that since the venue and vendors were already booked, and since the non-refundable deposits were so significant, it would be a shame for it all to go to waste. They proposed a solution. They would take over the contracts, pay the remaining balances in full, and use the date for Isabel's urgent engagement party. They even offered Julian a substantial discretion and transfer fee, which was a prettier term for a bribe. Julian, to his credit, sounded deeply ashamed. "They were so convincing, Naomi. They had answers for everything. I should have called you, I know I should have, but they insisted you needed space. It felt wrong, but..." He trailed off. He had made a bad call, and he knew it. It was the same story, with slight variations, from every other vendor. The florist explained that a leaner had come in with my floral plan, my vision bored with the white peonies, the eucalyptus garlands, the delicate anemones, and claimed it was a mood board Isabel had helped me with, and that Isabel wanted to use it as a tribute to me during my difficult time. The bandleader told us that Richard had called, explaining that the wedding was off but they still wanted to retain the band for a family function, assuring him that the check would clear immediately. The photographer, a young artist we'd connected with deeply, was the most apologetic. He said he'd felt uneasy about the whole thing, but my parents had been so smooth, so seemingly sincere in their concern for my well-being. They had systematically weaponized my own reputation for being private and stoic, using it to create a believable fiction of me falling apart. With each call, the picture became clearer. This wasn't a spontaneous, clumsy attempt to help Isabel. This was a premeditated, coordinated campaign. They had used their money and social influence, combined with a fabricated story of my emotional collapse, to hijack the entire infrastructure of my wedding. They knew that vendors would be hesitant to lose a major booking, and they exploited that fear, making them an offer they couldn't refuse. After the last call, I sat back, looking at Ethan's notes. The page was filled with damning phrases: personal crisis, relationship on the rocks, Naomi needs space, we'll handle everything. They had not only stolen my wedding, they had stolen my narrative, painting me as a victim who needed rescuing. But as I looked at the notes, one detail stood out, repeated by almost every vendor. My parents had paid all the outstanding balances, yes. They had transferred communications and taken over the logistics. But the initial, massive, non-refundable deposits, the thousands of dollars that had secured the date, the venue, and the services in the first place, were all still under one name. Mine. They hadn't legally transferred the contracts. They had just paid off my bills. And in that one crucial oversight, I saw a glimmer of light. They hadn't demolished my building. They had just paid to finish the construction, and I was still holding the deed. The anger that had been simmering within me began to cool, crystallizing into something sharper and far more dangerous: purpose. The emotional, wounded part of me wanted to storm over to my parents' house and unleash a torrent of rage. But the architect in me, the part that had taken over, saw a different path. A confrontation would be messy, emotional, and ultimately unsatisfying. It would devolve into a screaming match where they would twist my words, play the victim, and gaslight me into oblivion. No, this situation didn't call for a wrecking ball. It called for a scalpel. They made a mistake, I said to Ethan, my voice low and steady. I pointed to the notes he'd taken. A big one. They paid the bills, but they never changed the name on the original agreements. They never went through the legal process of novation. They just took over. Ethan looked at the page, and a slow smile spread across his face as he understood. So legally speaking, he said, you're still the client. I'm more than the client, I replied, a new sense of power surging through me. I'm the host. It's my party. They're just the financiers. That evening, we didn't wallow. We went to work. I pulled out the heavy folder containing all our vendor contracts. For the next few hours, our dining table looked like a law library. We spread the documents out, reading through every clause, every line of fine print with highlighters and sticky notes. I was no lawyer, but my career had taught me how to decipher complex contractual language. I knew that the details, the little noticed clauses, were where the power lay. And there it was, in nearly every contract, a variation of the same clause. All services detailed herein are for the exclusive benefit of the client, S, named on this agreement. This agreement and the obligations and rights hereunder may not be assigned, delegated, or transferred to any third party without the prior written consent of all parties. We had never given written consent. Our names, Naomi and Ethan, were still on the dotted line. The plan began to form, elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't about destroying them or causing a scene. It was about reclaiming control. It was about enforcing the contract. It was about letting them proceed with their grand charade, right up until the final moment, and then simply revealing the truth. They had built this elaborate stage set, but I was the one who was going to direct the final act. First, we had a serious conversation. Do we even want this wedding anymore? Ethan asked, his voice gentle. The venue, the menu, all of it, is it tainted now? I thought about it. The beautiful Willow Creek estate, the flowers I'd so carefully chosen, the music we'd planned. It all felt like a crime scene. No, I said, a wave of clarity washing over me. That day, that wedding, it doesn't exist anymore. They killed it. What we have is an opportunity to do something that's just for us. A new vision began to take shape. Something small, intimate, and deeply personal. Something that couldn't be co-opted or stolen. Something that was purely about us. We decided then and there that we would elope. On the morning of September 21st, we would go to the courthouse with two of our closest friends as witnesses and get married. The big party they were throwing, that would no longer be our wedding. It would be something else entirely. The next day, I began making my second round of calls to the vendors. This time, my tone was different. It was not the voice of a confused victim, but of a client firmly in control. I started with Julian. "Julian," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument, "I'm calling to confirm the final details for my event on the 21st. There seems to have been a significant misunderstanding orchestrated by my parents, but I assure you the event is proceeding as scheduled under my direction." I could practically hear him sweating through the phone. "Naomi, your parents." "My parents," I interrupted smoothly, "have generously decided to cover the costs of my event. I am, however, the sole signatory on our contract, and as such, all further communication will come exclusively through me or my fiancé, Ethan." "Is that understood?" He agreed immediately, the relief in his voice palpable. He was off the hook. I made the same call to the caterer, the florist, the band, and the photographer. The response was universal: relief and immediate compliance. They were contractually bound to me, and they knew it. My parents had put them in an awkward position, and I was giving them a clean, legal way out. I confirmed every detail of the original plan: the menu, the floral arrangements, the song list. But then I made a few small but crucial adjustments. I asked the caterer to add a champagne tower for a special toast. I asked the band to have a microphone and stand ready for me on the stage. I instructed the photographer to focus on candid guest reactions during the speeches. I also made one more booking: a car to pick up me and Ethan from the city courthouse and drive us to the Willow Creek estate with an arrival time of exactly 7:30 p.m., just as the main course was being cleared. The last piece of the puzzle was to maintain radio silence with my family. They had created a narrative in which I was a fragile, heartbroken mess who needed space. I decided to give them exactly that. I didn't answer their calls or respond to their texts. Let them believe I was at home, falling apart. Let them walk into their party feeling confident, triumphant, and completely in control. They thought they were the architects of this grand event. They had no idea they were merely the construction crew, working tirelessly to build a stage for a play they hadn't read the script for. And I, the director, was ready for opening night. The morning of September 21st was beautiful. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, and the autumn air had a hint of warmth to it, a perfect day. While my sister Isabel was likely being pampered by a team of hair and makeup artists, believing this was the prelude to her grand entrance into society, my own preparations were much simpler. Ethan and I had breakfast at our favorite little diner, sharing a plate of pancakes and laughing about the absurdity of it all. There were no jitters, no stress, just a profound sense of peace and rightness. This was how it was always meant to be. At 11 a.m., we met our two best friends at the city courthouse. I wore a simple, elegant ivory sheath dress I'd bought off the rack the week before. Ethan was in a sharp navy suit. There was no large audience, no fanfare. It was just us, our friends, and a justice of the peace with a kind smile. As we exchanged our vows, the ones we'd written ourselves, the noise of the past few months, the betrayal, the anger, the planning faded away into nothing. All that was left was him and me, our promises echoing in the quiet, sunlit room. When the justice pronounced us husband and wife, the joy I felt was more real and more powerful than anything I could have ever orchestrated at a massive, expensive event. We had done it. We had built our own foundation, small and solid and unshakable. Meanwhile, my phone was buzzing incessantly in my clutch, a stream of texts and missed calls from my mother, father, and Isabel. "Where are you? Isabel needs you." "Naomi, this isn't funny, call me back immediately." "Are you really going to ruin your sister's day by not showing up?" So typical. They were so wrapped up in their own drama that they hadn't even realized I wasn't playing a part in it anymore. I read the messages to Ethan as we sat in a quiet park after the ceremony, sipping champagne our friends had brought. We just shook our heads and laughed. As evening approached, we headed home to change. For the party, our party, I had something special. It was the dress I had originally intended to wear for my wedding reception, a stunning, floor-length silk gown that was both sophisticated and undeniably bridal. Ethan changed into a classic black tuxedo. When we looked at each other in the mirror, we didn't see two people going into battle. We saw a husband and wife, ready to celebrate their marriage. At exactly 7:15 p.m., our hired car pulled up to the entrance of the Willow Creek estate. We could hear the sounds of the jazz ensemble and the cheerful chatter of 200 guests. We asked the driver to wait a few minutes. We sat in the back of the car, holding hands, taking one last deep breath. "Ready?" Ethan asked. I squeezed his hand. "Ready." We walked in at 7:30, right on schedule. The Great Hall was breathtaking. Julian had outdone himself. My peonies and eucalyptus garlands adorned every surface, the candlelight glowed, and the band played softly from the stage. And in the center of it all were my parents, beaming with pride, and my sister Isabel, holding court in a frothy white dress that was a wedding gown in all but name. They were the picture of triumph. The moment we stepped through the grand archway, a hush fell over the room. Heads turned, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. My parents' smiles froze on their faces. Isabel's jaw literally dropped. We didn't look like defeated, heartbroken people. We looked radiant. Ignoring their shocked stares, we simply smiled and began to circulate, greeting our friends who were in on the secret with hugs and winks, and accepting confused congratulations from other guests who just assumed we were there to support Isabel. We made our way to the stage area, where Julian gave me a subtle nod. The microphone was ready. Just as my father, Richard, recovered enough to step forward and tap his glass for a toast, I beat him to it. I picked up the M. Microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the hall. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight." All eyes were on me. My family looked like they were about to explode. I'd like to start by extending a huge, heartfelt thank you to my incredibly generous parents, Alina and Richard. I gestured towards them. They looked momentarily pleased, caught in the headlights of public praise. When they heard Ethan and I were getting married, they insisted on throwing us the most spectacular celebration imaginable, and as you can see, they spared no expense. We are just so grateful. The confusion in the room was now palpable. Guests were looking from my parents to Isabel, whose face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. "And I'm so glad you could all be here tonight," I continued, my voice ringing with joy, "to celebrate this incredible moment with my husband, Ethan, and me." I held up my left hand, flashing the simple, elegant wedding band that now sat beside my engagement ring. Ethan stepped up beside me and wrapped his arm around my waist. We were married this afternoon at the city courthouse. It was absolutely perfect. A collective gasp went through the room. Which makes this officially the most beautiful and lavish wedding reception we could have ever dreamed of. I then turned my attention to my family, my smile never wavering. Now, I know there's been some confusion. My parents were under the impression that we had canceled our wedding, and in a hilarious, almost sitcom-worthy mix-up, they used all of our non-refundable deposits and plans to throw this party for my sister instead. A classic case of wires getting crossed. I laughed, a light, airy sound that belied the steel in my voice. So let's hear it again for my parents, for accidentally throwing their newlywed daughter and son-in-law the party of a lifetime. And to my sister Isabel, I said, looking her right in the eye, "Don't worry, I'm sure your actual engagement party, whenever that may be, will be just as special." A toast, I raised my champagne glass, to my husband and to my parents for paying for it all. Cheers. The sound of 200 champagne glasses clinking together, prompted by confused but polite guests, was the last thing I heard before the chaos erupted. My toast, delivered with a smile, had been a surgical strike, and its impact was immediate and devastating. Isabel let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a shriek and ran from the room, her ridiculous white dress trailing behind her. My mother, Alina, stood frozen, her face pale with shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. My father, Richard, turned a shade of crimson I had never seen before and began sputtering, unable to form a coherent sentence. His carefully constructed image as the magnanimous patriarch had just been dismantled in front of all his friends, family, and business associates. Ethan and I didn't stick around to watch the fallout. Our job was done. We had not yelled, we had not accused. We had simply stated the truth, wrapped in a veneer of cheerful gratitude that made it impossible for them to refute without looking petty and foolish. We placed our champagne glasses on a nearby table, and with our arms linked, we walked through the stunned crowd. A few of our close friends intercepted us near the door, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. "That was legendary," my best friend whispered, hugging me tightly. We just smiled, thanked them for coming to our wedding, and slipped out into the cool night air. As we got into our waiting car, we could hear the murmur from the party turn into a dull roar. We didn't look back. The days that followed were a predictable storm of digital rage. My phone was inundated with voicemails, texts, and emails from my family. They cycled through every possible tactic. There were the furious, rambling messages from my father, accusing me of humiliating him and threatening financial and legal repercussions. There were the tearful, manipulative voicemails from my mother, wailing about how I could be so cruel and ungrateful to my own family after all they'd done for me. And then there were the texts from Isabel, a barrage of pure, unfiltered venom, calling me every name imaginable and accusing me of ruining her life. We didn't listen to most of them. I created a special folder for the messages, saved them, and then I blocked all their numbers. Ethan and I left the next morning for a spontaneous honeymoon, a quiet week in a small cabin by a lake, where the only sounds were the crackling fire and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. We needed to decompress and reconnect, to focus on the new life we had just started. When we returned, a crisp, formal letter was waiting for us. It was from a law firm representing my parents. It was vaguely worded but heavily threatening, alluding to slander, reputational damage, and financial malfeasance. They were trying to intimidate us, to scare us into an apology or some kind of retraction. They underestimated me. I was not the emotional daughter they could manipulate. I was a professional who understood contracts. We didn't even hire a lawyer. Instead, Ethan and I spent an evening drafting a response ourselves. It was a simple, 2-page letter. The first page laid out the undisputed facts in a clear, numbered list. The dates the contracts were signed by me, the amounts of the non-refundable deposits paid by me and Ethan, and the clause from the contracts stating they were non-transferable without written consent. The second page was a collection of photocopies, the signed contracts with my name on them, and the bank statements showing the deposits clearing from my account. We concluded the letter by stating that we considered the matter closed and that any further legal correspondence would be interpreted as harassment. We sent it via certified mail. We never heard from their lawyer or from them ever again. Life without my family was, at first, strange. Their drama had taken up so much space in my head for so many years that its absence left a noticeable void. But then, something wonderful happened. The void began to fill up with peace. Ethan and I focused on building our own family, a community of friends who supported us, celebrated with us, and loved us unconditionally. Our weekends were no longer consumed by stressful family dinners, but by happy, relaxed gatherings with the people who actually cared about us. Months later, I heard through a cousin that Isabel and Marcus had eventually gotten married. There was no gala, no grand affair. They had a small ceremony at a local restaurant with only a handful of guests. The story was that my parents' finances and their social standing had taken a significant hit after what the family now referred to as the incident. I didn't feel a sense of triumph or glee. I just felt a quiet, detached sense of closure. Their actions had consequences, and they were now living with them. About a year after our wedding, Ethan and I bought a small plot of land a little ways out of the city. As an architect, my ultimate dream had always been to design my own home. We spent months working on the blueprints together. It was a true collaboration, a fusion of his desire for a warm, comfortable space and my love for clean lines and natural light. It was our new foundation, built not on obligation or expectation, but on love, respect, and a shared vision for the future. One evening, we were standing on the empty lot, looking at the plans spread across the hood of our car as the sun set. Ethan wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder. "A skyscraper or a wedding?" he murmured, echoing his words from so long ago. I smiled, leaning back against him. "It's a home," I said, "and every single part of it is ours."